Some souls do not arrive at your door by accident. They crawl there because the world has left them nowhere else to go. Snow pressed hard against the cabin windows high in the forests outside Revelstoke, British Columbia, turning the night into a blur of white and shadow. The old pine walls creaked softly beneath the weight of winter, while a tired wood stove crackled in uneven breaths beside the narrow kitchen. Ethan Mercer sat alone at the small cedar table with a half-finished mug of black coffee growing cold between his hands. The digital clock above the sink glowed 2:13 a.m. in pale green numbers. Outside, the wind dragged through the trees with a low hollow moan that reminded him too much of distant sirens. He hated that sound. Even after 2 years away from the VPDU, a Western Canadian urban police division focused on organized crime response, his body still reacted before his mind did. Tight shoulders, locked jaw, breathing shallow enough to hurt. The cabin had been supposed to fix that. 40 kilometers from the nearest town. No neighbors. No traffic. No radios screaming through dispatch channels. Just snow, trees, silence, and enough isolation to bury old memories beneath winter. But trauma was stubborn. It followed people into the woods. Ethan rubbed a hand across the scar near his temple and stared at the storm outside. Sleep had not visited him in days. Then came the sound. Scratch. Soft at first. Barely there beneath the wind. Ethan froze. His eyes shifted slowly toward the front door. Another scrape followed, weaker this time. Then silence. He reached for the flashlight hanging beside the table and stood carefully, every instinct inside him waking at once. Years in uniform had trained his body to expect danger before explanation. The old floorboards groaned beneath his socks as he crossed the cabin. One hand gripped the flashlight. The other rested near the small bear spray canister mounted beside the door. The scratching came again. Fragile, uneven, almost desperate. Ethan pulled the door open against the heavy snowdrift, and cold mountain air slammed into the cabin like icy water. For a second, he saw nothing except darkness and falling snow swirling beneath the yellow porch light. Then the shape moved. A Doberman stood barely upright at the edge of the porch. Female. Black and rust coat, soaked nearly to the skin. Snow clung to her narrow frame, while her ribs showed faintly beneath wet fur. One front leg trembled violently. Her breathing came in shallow bursts that clouded the freezing air. And beneath her body, Ethan noticed the swollen curve of pregnancy. The dog lifted her head slowly toward him. Amber eyes. Exhausted. Guarded. Still alert despite the cold, trying to pull her under. Ethan had seen that look before. Not in dogs. In officers after bad calls. In survivors. A thin streak of blood marked the snow behind her paw, though the storm had already begun to hide it. Around her neck hung only a torn strip of black material where a collar used to be. No tags. No owner. No sound except the wind moving through the pines. Ethan exhaled slowly, his chest tightening for reasons he could not explain. Easy, he whispered, though his own voice sounded unfamiliar in the dark. The Doberman did not growl, did not bark. She simply looked past him into the cabin itself. Not at the warmth, not at the fire, at the house, as though she recognized it. Ethan frowned slightly. The dog took one weak step forward onto the porch, then another. Her legs buckled without warning. He caught her before she struck the frozen boards. She was lighter than she should have been, bones beneath soaked fur, trembling from exhaustion and cold. The moment his hands touched her, the dog released a faint sound deep in her throat. Not fear, relief. Ethan looked down at her shaking body while snow drifted silently around them both. Somewhere beyond the trees, thunder rolled across the mountains. And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Ethan Mercer no longer felt alone. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke, wet wool, and old loneliness. Snow hissed softly against the windows while Ethan Mercer knelt beside the wood stove with the Doberman wrapped in 2 faded blankets from an old plastic storage bin marked winter gear. Melted snow dripped from her coat onto the worn pine floorboards. Up close, she looked worse than he first thought. Her breathing came unevenly, sides trembling beneath the rise of pregnancy. One ear bore a small notch near the tip, clean and deliberate, the kind Ethan had seen before on working dogs. Not strays. Trained dogs. The realization sat heavily in his chest. Who left you out there? He murmured quietly. The dog opened her eyes for half a second at the sound of his voice, then closed them again as though simply staying awake had become exhausting. Ethan reached for the old first aid kit beneath the sink and placed it beside him. His movements were careful but stiff. The ache in his right shoulder always worsened during storms. Some nights it felt like memory itself lived inside the bones. He soaked a cloth in warm water and gently cleaned the shallow cut along the Doberman's front leg. Nothing life-threatening, but infection had already started setting in around older wounds hidden beneath the fur. He noticed faint pressure marks around her neck where a collar had once been secured tightly for a long time. Working K9. No question now. The dog flinched suddenly when the kettle on the stove gave a sharp whistle. Ethan froze instinctively, pulse spiking hard enough to make his vision blur for a moment. In an instant the cabin disappeared. Sirens. Flashing red and blue lights against freezing rain. Radio chatter screaming over itself. A narrow apartment hallway in downtown Calgary 6 years earlier. Someone yelling from behind a barricaded door. Then the sound nobody in law enforcement ever forgets. The crack of a gunshot in close quarters. Ethan shut his eyes tightly. Not now. The kettle whistled again. Just a kettle. Just the storm. He forced himself to breathe slowly until the memory loosened its grip. Across the room, the Doberman lifted her head weakly, watching him in silence. It unsettled him slightly, the way she observed without fear. Not like an animal waiting to be fed, more like someone studying another wounded creature. Ethan stood and poured hot water into a chipped ceramic mug. His hand still shook faintly. He hated that part most. The trembling. Back when he worked for NPDU, Northern Prairie Defense Unit, a tactical emergency response division operating across Western Canada, his hands had been steady enough to hold pressure on a dying partner for 12 straight minutes while waiting for medevac. Now a kettle whistle could undo him. He stared into the dark coffee for a long moment. Retirement had not been a choice. After the inquiry, after the panic attacks, after the sleepless nights and the mandatory leave evaluations, people stopped looking at him like an officer and started looking at him like a liability. Ethan sold his townhouse in Edmonton 3 months later and vanished into the mountains with what little remained of his savings. No family, no wife, no children, just silence and a cabin nobody wanted because the winters here were too harsh. The Doberman shifted weakly near the stove. Ethan crouched beside her again and noticed something strange. Her eyes were fixed on the hallway leading deeper into the cabin, toward the basement door. Even exhausted, she seemed alert whenever she looked there. Her ears twitched slightly. Ethan followed her gaze. The basement stairs disappeared into darkness beneath the old house. He had barely gone down there since moving in. The previous owner left most of the storage untouched. Old shelves, broken tools, boxes full of forgotten things. The dog let out a faint sound in her throat. Not a growl. Not fear. Recognition. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" he whispered. The storm outside deepened. Somewhere below the cabin, a soft metallic sound echoed from the basement. Like something shifting gently in the dark. The sound came again. Soft. Metallic. Ethan Mercer stood motionless near the basement door while the storm pressed harder against the cabin walls. The old hinges rattled faintly beneath the wind outside, but this sound had come from below. Inside the house, the Doberman lifted her head from the blankets near the stove and stared toward the darkness beneath the stairs with sharp amber eyes that no longer looked half asleep. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, there was alertness in her posture. Purpose. Ethan reached for the flashlight resting on the counter and moved carefully toward the basement door. The air inside the hallway felt colder there somehow, carrying the scent of damp wood and old dust. He paused with one hand resting against the knob. Probably pipes, he muttered under his breath, though he did not fully believe it himself. The cabin was nearly 70 years old. Mountain cold could make any structure groan like it remembered ghosts. Still, instinct tightened in his chest. The same instinct that had once kept him alive during late-night warrants and silent apartment searches. He slowly opened the basement door. Darkness waited beneath. Narrow wooden stairs disappeared downward into blackness while cold air drifted upward carrying a faint smell of rust and cedar oil. Ethan clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through, floating dust particles and old shadows. Nothing moved. Just shelves. Storage bins. Broken furniture left behind by the previous owner. Yet the Doberman behind him released a low, uneasy whine. Ethan glanced back. She had somehow pushed herself halfway upright despite exhaustion, eyes fixed on the basement with unsettling intensity. "Stay," he said quietly. The words slipped out naturally, years of command training still buried inside him somewhere. To his surprise, the dog obeyed immediately. Ethan frowned slightly at that. Not stray behavior. Definitely trained. He descended the stairs one careful step at a time. The wood creaked beneath his weight, while the flashlight beam drifted slowly across the basement walls. Old tools hung from rusted nails. A workbench sat beneath a small frosted window, almost buried by snow outside. Cobwebs stretched between shelves lined with forgotten paint cans and cracked fishing equipment. Then the beam landed on something strange near the far corner. Scratches. Long claw marks carved into the concrete floor near an old metal cabinet. Ethan crouched slowly. The marks were not fresh, but they were deliberate. Animal scratches. Large dog. He stared at them for a moment before another sound broke the silence. Clink. Ethan turned sharply toward the source. A loose chain hanging from the side of the cabinet swayed gently on its own. The movement was small, almost invisible, but enough. His pulse quickened. He stepped closer and opened the cabinet door carefully. Inside sat old blankets, several empty storage tins, and a faded green duffel bag coated in dust. Ethan pulled it free and brushed off the top with his sleeve. Embroidered across the fabric were faded black letters. G. Holt. Below the name was another marking almost worn away completely. K-9 unit. Ethan stared at the bag while a strange heaviness settled into the room. He remembered the realtor mentioning the previous owner only once during the sale. Older man. Lived alone. Died years earlier. No family wanted the property after that. Ethan slowly unzipped the duffel bag. Inside rested old training equipment for police dogs. Leather bite sleeves. Worn tennis balls. A cracked stainless steel water bowl. Beneath them lay several faded photographs held together by a rusted paperclip. Ethan lifted the top photo into the flashlight beam. A white man in winter tactical gear stood smiling beside a black and rust Doberman wearing a service harness. Snow fell heavily around them. The man's arm rested proudly against the dog's shoulders. Ethan's breath caught softly in his throat. The dog in the photograph looked almost identical to the one upstairs. Same narrow face. Same alert amber eyes. Even the small notch near the ear was there. Upstairs, the Doberman suddenly barked once. Sharp. Urgent. Then came the sound Ethan had begun to fear most. A painful cry, followed by the heavy crash of something falling near the stove. The photograph slipped from Ethan Mercer's fingers as he rushed up the basement stairs two at a time. Another sharp cry echoed through the cabin above him, strained and frightened enough to send cold adrenaline through his chest. The storm hammered the roof harder now, wind shoving against the old walls while snow rattled against the windows like thrown gravel. Ethan reached the top of the stairs and stopped abruptly. The Doberman had collapsed beside the wood stove. One of the kitchen chairs lay overturned nearby, where she must have struck it trying to stand. Her body trembled violently beneath the blankets, sides rising too fast, too uneven. And beneath her, dark fluid stained the old pine floorboards. Ethan's pulse tightened instantly. No, stay with me, he said, kneeling beside her. The dog tried to lift her head at the sound of his voice, but could barely manage it. Her breathing came sharp and shallow now. Pain had overtaken exhaustion. Ethan looked toward the windows instinctively. Outside, the world had vanished into white. Snow buried the porch railing nearly halfway. The narrow logging road leading down the mountain would already be impossible until morning, maybe longer. No veterinarian could reach them tonight. No emergency services either. They were alone. The realization settled heavily over the room. Ethan swallowed hard and forced himself into motion. Panic never helped anyone survive. He had learned that long ago. He grabbed more towels from the bathroom shelf and spread them carefully beside the stove. The warmth from the fire filled the cabin with the scent of burning cedar and wet fur while the old radio near the kitchen counter crackled faintly with static before dying again completely. Power lines must have gone down somewhere deeper in the valley. Ethan checked the dog's breathing once more, then froze when he noticed something. Her eyes remained fixed on him the entire time. Not wild, not fearful, trusting him. Completely. It unsettled him more than fear would have. You picked the wrong cabin for this, he muttered quietly, though there was no bitterness left in his voice now. Only worry. The Doberman let out another painful whine, and suddenly memory hit him harder than the storm outside. A hospital corridor in Edmonton. Bright fluorescent lights. The smell of antiseptic. A nurse placing a trembling newborn into the arms of a young mother after a roadside collision years ago. Ethan had stood guard outside that room during his patrol shift while snow fell beyond the emergency entrance. He remembered the tiny cry of that infant more clearly than any gunfire he had ever heard. Life arriving in the middle of chaos always sounded fragile. Sacred, somehow. The dog's breathing hitched sharply again, dragging him back to the present. Ethan stood quickly and searched the cabinets for anything useful. Old thermal blankets, bottled water, medical tape, a flashlight lantern. He lined them beside the stove with the quiet focus of someone trying not to think too far ahead. His hands trembled less now that there was something concrete to do. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains low and distant. The Doberman suddenly shifted violently against the towels. Ethan dropped beside her again, just as another contraction rippled through her body. She cried out softly and pressed her muzzle against his forearm. "Easy," he whispered. "You are all right. Just breathe." The words sounded strange coming from him. Gentle. Human. He had not spoken softly to anyone in years. The dog's paw pushed weakly against his leg, as if searching for balance. Ethan placed one hand carefully against her shoulder to steady her. Her coat felt ice-cold despite the heat from the stove. Then he noticed something else beneath the trembling. A small movement along her abdomen. One of the puppies shifting inside her. Ethan stared for a moment, silent. Tiny life still fighting to survive beneath all this pain. The cabin creaked loudly as another gust of wind slammed against the mountainside. Somewhere near the back hallway, the lights flickered once. Twice. Then darkness swallowed the entire cabin. The wood stove remained the only glow left, throwing soft amber light across the room, while shadows stretched long across the walls. The Doberman let out another strained cry. Ethan reached blindly for the flashlight lantern beside him and switched it on. Warm yellow light filled the cabin again. The dog's breathing had worsened. Too fast now. Too weak between contractions. Ethan felt fear creeping quietly into his chest. Not the violent fear of police work. Something deeper. Older. The fear of watching another living thing slip away while your hands are the only ones left to help. Sometimes the smallest sound in the world is the one that keeps a broken soul alive. The storm deepened over the mountains beyond Revelstoke while Ethan Mercer sat cross-legged beside the wood stove, the lantern casting trembling gold light across the cabin walls. Snow buried the windows almost completely now. The outside world had vanished beneath winter. Inside, the only sounds left were the crackle of burning cedar, the wind pressing against the roof, and the strained breathing of the Doberman fighting through another contraction. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his flannel shirt despite the cold. He had not felt this helpless in years. The dog trembled violently against the towels beneath her, muscles tightening beneath soaked black fur, while exhaustion pulled harder at her with every passing minute. Yet she kept lifting her head toward him after each wave of pain, searching for him through the dim light, as if making sure he had not walked away. Ethan leaned closer carefully. "You are tougher than you look," he whispered softly. Her ears twitched faintly at the sound of his voice. Outside, thunder rolled low through the mountains again. The lantern flickered. Another contraction came harder this time. The Doberman cried out sharply and pushed weakly against the towels. Ethan swallowed hard. He remembered enough from emergency response training to know what was happening now. Too early. Too much stress on her body. He reached for the thermal blanket beside him and draped it gently across her shoulders while speaking in the calmest voice he could manage. "Stay with me. Just stay with me." The words sounded less like instructions and more like a prayer. Then suddenly the first puppy arrived. Tiny. Fragile. Barely larger than Ethan's two hands together. For one terrible second the cabin fell completely silent except for the storm outside. No movement. No cry. Ethan's chest tightened painfully. The Doberman tried weakly to lift her head toward the puppy, but lacked the strength to move farther. Her breathing had become frighteningly shallow now. Ethan stared at the motionless little body wrapped in dim lantern light, and something old cracked open inside him. Not again. The thought came fast and sharp enough to hurt. He was no longer in the cabin. He was back beneath freezing rain outside a downtown Edmonton apartment complex 6 years earlier, kneeling beside Officer Daniel Reeves after a gunfight gone wrong. Ethan remembered pressing both shaking hands against his partner's chest while sirens screamed somewhere nearby. He remembered saying the same words over and over. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." But Daniel had not. Ethan blinked hard and forced himself back into the present before memory swallowed him whole. The tiny puppy still lay silent beside the exhausted Doberman. Ethan carefully lifted the newborn into a dry towel. So small, barely breathing, if at all. Fear gripped him instantly, but training moved faster. He rubbed the puppy gently with the towel to warm it, hands trembling less now that purpose had returned. "Come on, little one," he whispered. "Not tonight." The Doberman watched him through half-closed eyes. Ethan continued rubbing warmth into the tiny body while the storm roared outside the cabin like the entire mountain was trying to tear itself apart. Seconds passed, long enough to feel unbearable. Then suddenly the puppy jerked weakly once. Ethan froze. Another tiny movement followed. And then came the sound. Small, raspy, fragile enough to disappear beneath the storm if not for the silence inside the room. A cry. Ethan shut his eyes for one brief second as relief hit him harder than expected. The Doberman released a faint, exhausted whine beside him, almost like she understood. Ethan wrapped the puppy carefully in a dry towel and placed it gently near her chest. Instinct returned to the mother immediately despite her weakness. She lowered her muzzle protectively over the tiny, trembling body while tears Ethan had spent years burying burned unexpectedly behind his eyes. The lantern light flickered softly across the cabin walls while snow buried the mountain deeper outside. For the first time in longer than Ethan could remember, the room no longer felt haunted. It felt alive. By dawn, the storm had begun to loosen its grip on the mountains. Snow still clung heavily to the pines surrounding the cabin, bending branches beneath thick, white weight, but the wind had softened into a tired whisper moving across the valley. Inside, the wood stove burned low and steady while pale morning light filtered through frost-covered windows in thin silver ribbons. Ethan Mercer sat on the floor beside the stove with his back against the couch, exhaustion carved deep into his face. He had not slept. The Doberman lay curled protectively around two newborn puppies now wrapped in dry blankets near her chest. The firstborn slept quietly, tiny sides rising and falling with fragile determination. The second had arrived just before sunrise after another long hour of trembling pain and whispered encouragement. Smaller than the first, weaker, but alive. Ethan stared at them in silence while steam rose faintly from the fresh coffee cooling untouched beside him. He had forgotten how small new life looked, how impossible it seemed that something so fragile could still choose to fight this hard. The Doberman lifted her head slightly when Ethan moved, amber eyes following him carefully. Not fearful anymore, watching him the way partners watch each other after surviving something terrible together. Ethan gave a tired nod toward her. "You did good," he said quietly. The dog blinked slowly before lowering her head back beside the puppies. Outside, a raven landed somewhere near the roof, its distant call echoing softly through the trees. For the first time in years, the silence inside the cabin no longer felt empty. Ethan stood slowly, knees aching from the long night, and carried another log to the stove. The warmth filled the room with the smell of cedar and smoke while soft crackling sounds settled into the old cabin walls. He glanced toward the basement hallway again without meaning to. The photograph from the duffel bag still rested on the kitchen table beneath the lantern. The dead owner beside a Doberman that looked almost exactly like the one sleeping beside his stove now. Same eyes, same scar near the ear, even the same calm intensity. Ethan walked toward the table and picked up the photograph carefully. On the back, faded handwriting barely remained visible beneath years of wear. Winter Unit. Nix. Ethan stared at the name for several seconds. Nix, he repeated softly under his breath. The Doberman's ears twitched instantly from across the room. Ethan slowly turned toward her. The dog had lifted her head again, eyes fixed directly on him now. Recognition, clear enough to send a chill through him stronger than the cold outside. "That is your name, is it not?" he asked quietly. Nix gave the faintest movement of her tail against the blanket. Ethan exhaled slowly and sat back down near the stove, the photograph still resting in his hands. He studied the man standing beside the younger Doberman in the picture. Graham Holt. Whoever he had been, he looked like someone Ethan would have trusted on a bad night. Calm eyes, weathered face, one hand resting gently against the dog as though he understood loyalty was something borrowed, not owned. Ethan rubbed his thumb against the worn edge of the photograph. Looks like you came home, he murmured. Nix watched him quietly while one of the puppies released a tiny sleepy cry beneath her front leg. She immediately lowered her muzzle protectively over both newborns. Instinct, love, duty. Ethan felt something painful shift softly inside his chest. He had spent years trying to outrun memory, trying to bury guilt beneath isolation and mountain silence. But somewhere between the storm, the birth, and the sound of those tiny cries beside the fire, the walls inside him had started cracking open. He looked around the cabin differently now, not as a place to disappear, as shelter, as refuge. The realization frightened him slightly. Healing always did. A weak beam of sunlight finally broke through the clouds outside, spilling pale gold across the frost-covered window and stretching warmth slowly across the floorboards toward Nix and her puppies. The Doberman closed her eyes beneath the light for a moment, finally resting without fear. Ethan sat beside the stove listening to the quiet breathing filling the room. Then, for the first time in almost 6 years, he realized something astonishing. The nightmares had not followed him into the morning. 3 days later, the mountain finally exhaled. Sunlight poured across the frozen valley outside the cabin, turning the snowfields around Revelstoke into endless silver glass beneath a pale Canadian sky. Thin smoke curled peacefully from the chimney while pine trees stood heavy and silent along the ridge like old guardians watching from afar. Inside, warmth had settled into every corner of the cabin. The old wood stove crackled steadily. A kettle hummed softly near the kitchen sink. And beside the fire, Nix slept with both puppies curled tightly against her chest beneath a thick wool blanket Ethan Mercer had not used since moving. There, the cabin no longer smelled like isolation. It smelled like coffee, cedar smoke, wet paws, and life. Ethan stood near the frost-covered window holding a mug between both hands while morning light stretched across the floorboards. His beard had grown rougher over the past few days, and exhaustion still lived beneath his eyes. But something else had returned too. Calm. The kind that did not need silence to survive. One of the puppies released a tiny squeak from beside the stove. Nix lifted her head immediately, alert despite fatigue, checking them before relaxing again once she saw Ethan watching over them nearby. Ethan smiled faintly. You still do not trust me completely, he murmured. Nix blinked once, almost offended by the accusation. The sound made him laugh quietly under his breath. Real laughter this time. Not forced. Not borrowed for someone else's comfort. He walked slowly toward the basement stairs carrying the old photograph and the faded duffel bag he had found during the storm. Sunlight reached deeper into the basement now through the small frosted window, illuminating years of forgotten dust across the concrete floor. Ethan crouched beside the old metal cabinet again and studied the claw marks near its base. Then his eyes shifted toward a loose section of wall paneling behind the workbench. He frowned slightly. The nails holding it in place looked newer than everything else down there. Someone had hidden something. Ethan carefully pried the panel loose using an old screwdriver from the workbench drawer. Behind it sat a narrow metal lockbox wrapped in faded cloth. His pulse tightened instinctively, old training still buried deep enough to wake during moments like this. He lifted the box slowly and carried it upstairs. Nix watched him carefully from beside the fire while the puppies stirred weakly against her side. Ethan placed the box on the kitchen table beneath the morning light. No lock remained attached anymore, just rusted hinges. He opened it carefully. Inside rested several documents sealed in plastic, an old service badge, and a folded handwritten letter yellowed by time. Ethan unfolded the letter slowly. The handwriting was rough but steady. If someone finds this cabin after I am gone, take care of Nix if she ever returns home. She was never just a service dog. She saved my life more times than I deserved. The rest of the page shook slightly in Ethan's hands as he continued reading. Graham Holt had once worked for CBRU, a Canadian border response unit specializing in wilderness trafficking investigations across British Columbia and Alberta. Years earlier, during a raid near the mountain passes, Nix had detected hidden survivors trapped inside a transport container abandoned during a blizzard. Holt credited her with saving 5 lives that night. But after he became ill, the department retired Nix and moved her temporarily into private boarding while Holt recovered. He never made it home. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. Silence settled across the cabin again except for the quiet breathing near the stove. Nix stared at him from across the room with calm amber eyes. Waiting. Ethan looked down at the final line of the letter. Dogs remember where love lives, even after loss. His throat tightened unexpectedly. He folded the paper carefully and looked toward the Doberman lying beside her newborn puppies. Through all the cold, through hunger, pain, abandonment, and the storm itself, she had somehow found her way back to the last place she remembered being safe. Not because she was trained to, because love had taught her the road home. Ethan walked slowly across the room and sat beside her near the fire. Nix rested her head quietly against his knee without hesitation this time. Outside, snow slipped gently from the pine branches as sunlight warmed the mountain little by little. Ethan stared into the flames while one of the puppies crawled clumsily across the blanket toward his boot. He carefully lifted the tiny creature into his hands, and for the first time in many years, the old cabin no longer felt like a place where someone came to disappear. It felt like the place where 3 lost souls had finally been found.